A sickening metallic rasp echoes in the pitch black, the unmistakable sound of rusted steel gnawing through living bone. There is no anesthesia, no quiet countdown from 10, no slipping into a peaceful void. Just a flickering candle casting a faceless silhouette against a damp, cold stone wall. You can taste the copper in the freezing air, heavy with the stench of sweat and sheer panic. The patient is fully conscious, eyes dilated, staring straight into the abyss of his own agony. Thick hemp ropes groan as his muscles violently seize against the blood-stained wood. The surgeon's hands are not sterile, they are stained black from previous attempts at salvation. He raises the heavy steel blade, and it plunges with a sickening velocity. In this shadowed era, speed was the only mercy. A fast hack through flesh was a blessing, while a slow cut was a guaranteed death sentence. Healing was entirely indistinguishable from a brutal physical assault. It forces a chilling question. When does the desperate act of saving a life cross the invisible line into pure, unmitigated torture? Before we learned to put the mind to sleep, the operating room was a slaughterhouse, and the absolute cost of survival was a waking nightmare. To understand how humanity tolerated such butchery, we must step into the suffocating fog of the Victorian era. This was a world painted in soot and sepia, where open sewers mingled with the sharp bite of coal smoke. The cobblestone streets crawled with invisible death, and citizens viewed their mortality as an ever-present, lurking shadow. You must realize that during this age of ignorance, pain was never considered a biological warning to be silenced. In the collective consciousness, physical agony was deeply intertwined with profound philosophical and unrelenting religious convictions. Suffering was widely accepted as a divine crucible, a cleansing fire deliberately designed to test the human soul. To artificially sedate a patient was whispered to be an arrogant defiance of a higher divine will. The faceless silhouettes shuffling through damp alleys genuinely believed that enduring unspeakable pain proved their ultimate moral fortitude. Furthermore, the medical fraternity itself harbored a chilling fatalistic philosophy regarding the fragile mechanics of the human body. Prominent physicians held the terrifying belief that the sheer shock of agonizing pain kept the patient tethered to life. They documented violent thrashing and deafening screams not as torture, but as vital indicators of a strong physical constitution. A quiet patient was considered a dying patient, making the brutal bite of a scalpel a necessary spark to ignite fading life. Imagine the crushing psychological weight of this collective delusion pressing down upon those condemned to the wooden operating table. There was no public outcry against these barbaric practices because survival absolutely demanded a toll paid in blood. The surgeon, stepping into the dim amphitheater in a blood-stiffened frock coat, was never perceived as a monster. In the high-contrast monochrome of their reality, this blood-soaked figure was the ultimate savior, armed with grim determination. Society willingly surrendered to the blade because the alternatives lurking in the shadows were infinitely more horrifying than hell. Without microscopic understanding, disease was an invisible demon, and the rusted saw was humanity's only weapon to exorcise it. Medical theaters were packed shoulder to shoulder with curious spectators, smoking cheap cigars to mask the odor of rotting flesh. They gathered not to witness delicate healing, but to watch a desperate race against the ticking clock of hemorrhagic shock. It was a theater of the macabre, where the audience held their breath waiting for the slice of cold steel. Victims were completely stripped of autonomy, transformed into trembling vessels of scientific exploration beneath flickering apathetic candlelight. Picture the profound isolation of the patient, surrounded by a sea of faceless observers who viewed agony as a spectacle. There was no concept of psychological trauma, no comforting aftercare, and absolutely no solace offered to the shattered minds. This was an era defined by silent endurance, where citizens absorbed catastrophic physical trauma because it was the established order. The societal acceptance of these atrocities was a tragic necessity, built upon desperate ignorance and the instinct to survive. We judge them from modern sanctuaries of sterile white, forgetting our painless miracles were purchased with their echoing screams. The age of ignorance was not a time of intentional malice, but a terrifying epoch where humanity groped blindly for salvation. In that suffocating darkness, the only guiding light was the cold, unyielding gleam of a surgical blade tearing into tissue. Men and women walked willingly into these chambers of horror, fully aware that they might never walk back out. They offered their limbs and organs to the altar of primitive science, trading certain death for a sliver of hope. This collective surrender paved the bloody road for modern medicine, leaving behind a legacy carved entirely in human suffering. And it is within this claustrophobic atmosphere of fear and unquestioning obedience that the true nightmares begin to unfold. Out of this claustrophobic atmosphere of absolute compliance emerges one of the most chilling procedures ever conceived by the human mind. We find ourselves in a damp subterranean chamber where the heavy air is thick with the suffocating scent of sulfur and old oxidized blood. A solitary, faceless silhouette sits rigidly on a crude wooden stool, hands clutching the splintered edges in white-knuckled silent terror. This anonymous soul is plagued by relentless, blinding migraines, a torment that the attending physician diagnoses not as a neurological failure, but as literal demonic possession. The prescribed remedy is not a soothing botanical balm or a bitter tonic, but the brutal, mechanical opening of the human skull itself. Known as trepanation, this ancient, desperate practice was believed to create a physical doorway, allowing malevolent spirits or stagnant humors to finally escape the pressurized cranium. The physician, another imposing shadow standing in the flickering candlelight, approaches with a specialized hand-cranked drill called a trephine, its metal cold and utterly unforgiving. There is absolutely no delicate preparation, no numbing agent to dull the impending violation, only the harsh, immediate reality of cold steel pressing against warm skin. The first agonizing cut is made swiftly to peel back the scalp, exposing the pristine white expanse of the parietal bone to the stifling, contaminated air. Blood instantly rushes from the highly vascular tissue, painting the physician's rough hands in a slick, dark crimson that drips rhythmically onto the silent stone floor. The patient's muffled whimpers are swallowed by the oppressive darkness, a desperate biological plea ignored entirely in the name of twisted, archaic salvation. Now, the sharp centerpin of the trephine bites fiercely into the bone, anchoring the heavy instrument for the horrific mechanical rotation that is about to begin. With every deliberate, forceful twist of the handle, the serrated circular saw grinds against the skull, sending a sickening, hollow crunch echoing through the otherwise quiet room. The violent vibration travels violently down the patient's jaw and straight into their spine, an inescapable physical tremor that rattles the very core of their conscious existence. You can almost feel the abrasive friction, the gritty accumulation of powdered bone dust piling up as the jagged teeth of the saw chew deeper into the mind's fortress. The physician must maintain an immense, exhausting downward pressure while simultaneously executing a perfectly balanced rhythmic rotation of the heavy iron crank. A single microscopic miscalculation, a fraction of a millimeter too deep, and the rusted blade will plunge disastrously into the fragile pulsating tissue of the brain. Time stretches into an agonizing eternity for the faceless silhouette in the chair, who must remain absolutely, terrifyingly motionless despite the explosive pain erupting in their head. The sound of tearing bone is deafening in its intimacy, an acoustic nightmare trapped entirely within the acoustic confines of the patient's own shattering skull. As the saw finally breaches the inner table of the cranium, a sickening pop signals that the circular disc of bone has been entirely severed from the host. The surgeon utilizes a crude iron elevator to pry the bloody disc loose, lifting it away to expose the delicate rhythmic throbbing of the dura mater beneath. In this horrifying moment of culmination, the sacred barrier between human consciousness and the filthy, pathogen-filled air of the operating room is completely destroyed. The collective ignorance of the era celebrates this exact moment as a profound medical victory, an exorcism successfully completed through the sheer application of traumatic force. Yet, for the trembling patient, This is merely the brutal initiation into an agonizing aftermath fraught with the near certainty of fatal festering infection. The open wound, now a gaping chasm in their very physiological foundation, is hastily packed with unsterilized linens that offer absolutely no defense against the invisible predators of the air. Days will inevitably bleed into restless nights as the fever sets in, wrapping the patient in a delirious, burning haze that blurs the fragile lines between this world and the next. The pulsating agony of the exposed brain tissue becomes a constant, maddening companion, a brutal, pulsing reminder of the violent physical intrusion they were forced to endure. What was meant to be a divine liberation of the mind swiftly transforms into a suffocating, inescapable prison of physiological collapse and profound neurological decay. Some miraculously survived this barbaric ordeal, walking the cobblestone streets as living specters bearing deep concaved facial scars that forever marked them as survivors of the drill. But countless others faded silently into the shadows, their mutilated skulls eventually buried in unmarked muddy graves, anonymous casualties of a desperately misguided scientific ambition. The true tragedy lies not just in the physical mutilation, but in the profound systemic betrayal of trust between the afflicted and those who claimed the divine authority to heal them. These physicians were generally not acting out of intentional malice, but were themselves hopelessly trapped in a labyrinth of flawed theories, armed only with primitive tools and a dangerous overconfidence. They operated under the terrifying collective delusion that the human body was a mechanistic puzzle to be aggressively dismantled, rather than a fragile ecosystem requiring delicate, non-invasive preservation. And so, the trephine continued to spin through the centuries, a relentless iron engine of suffering justified entirely by the desperate universal human desire to find a cure. The grinding metallic sound of the bone saw is a haunting echo that still reverberates through the darkest corners of medical history, reminding us of the exorbitant price paid for early knowledge. It remains a stark, bloody testament to an era where the earnest pursuit of healing was practically indistinguishable from the most refined, sophisticated methods of physical torture. As we stare into the suffocating void of that surgically created darkness, we are forced to acknowledge the sheer, terrifying resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute butchery. The faceless silhouette trembling in the chair represents a countless legion of silent victims whose unimaginable pain served as the gruesome, necessary foundation upon which modern neurology was eventually built. Their silent, unrecorded screams remain forever trapped within those ancient, fractured skulls, demanding that we never forget the horrific, bloody crucible from which our contemporary medical salvation was forged. But as the blood coagulates on the stone floor, we must realize that the crude physical trauma of the blade was only the beginning of our descent into this historical abyss. As the centuries progressed, these primitive, rusted mechanical tools would be joined by an even more insidious, quiet arsenal of chemical nightmares masquerading as miraculous medical breakthroughs. The deafening, localized brutality of the saw was about to be matched and perhaps surpassed by the silent, invisible devastation of the apothecary's slowly acting poisons. We leave the silhouette in the flickering gloom, the rhythm of their weakening heartbeat fading into the background, as a new, far more deceptive era of medical horror begins to take shape. As the visceral horrors of the surgical theater faded into the background, a far more insidious nightmare was quietly brewing in the shadows. We must now descend from the bloody wooden tables into the suffocating, claustrophobic laboratories of the Victorian apothecary. This was a realm defined not by the deafening crunch of bone, but by the sinister, quiet dripping of toxic elixirs in the dark. Imagine a windowless room, its stagnant air thick with the acrid stench of burning sulfur, decaying botanicals, and heavy, unnatural metals. Row upon row of frosted glass vials line the walls, their contents obscured by a thick layer of dust and flickering, erratic candlelight. Within these fragile, opaque containers rested the ultimate pharmaceutical deception, an arsenal of slow-acting poisons masquerading as miraculous divine cures. Humanity had traded the swift, brutal honesty of the surgical blade for the slow, agonizing, and entirely invisible betrayal of chemical warfare. At the forefront of this horrific medical escalation was a substance so mesmerizing, yet so profoundly deadly, that it captivated the entire era. It was known as quicksilver, a heavy, shimmering liquid metal that we recognize today as the highly neurotoxic element, mercury. For centuries, mercury was heralded as the undisputed champion against an array of terrifying diseases, most notably the rampant scourge of syphilis. Physicians of the age of ignorance genuinely believed that the body needed to be violently purged of its microscopic, corrupting demons. They prescribed a regimen of extreme mercury toxicity designed to induce massive salivation, agonizing stomach cramps, and violent, unending physical tremors. Step into the suffocating gloom of a specialized treatment facility where a faceless silhouette is sealed entirely within a suffocating wooden sweatbox. Only the patient's head protrudes from the heavy timber frame, their eyes wide with a quiet, desperate terror as the temperature slowly rises. Beneath the wooden structure, a pan of raw mercury is placed over an open, crackling flame, releasing highly concentrated, invisible fumes. The patient is forced to inhale these vaporized heavy metals, the toxic fog seeping directly into their lungs and saturating their bloodstream. The air within the box becomes a thick, blistering sauna of pure poison, pressing down upon the lungs with an unbearable, invisible weight. A distinct, foul, metallic taste begins to coat the back of the patient's throat, an unmistakable harbinger of the profound decay to come. They were told that the extreme suffering, the suffocating heat, and the sudden violent nausea were undeniable proof that the treatment was working. This agonizing process would be repeated relentlessly, day after desperate day, slowly replacing the body's natural vitality with a heavy metallic death. If the toxic vapors were deemed insufficient, the apothecary would forcefully rub harsh mercury-laced salves directly onto the patient's open, weeping sores. The cure aggressively accelerated the deterioration of the human form, attacking the central nervous system with a cold, methodical, and chilling efficiency. Within mere weeks, the tragic consequences of this chemical salvation would physically manifest in the most gruesome and humiliating ways imaginable. The gums of the afflicted would slowly turn a necrotizing pitch black, swelling grotesquely before their teeth simply rotted and tumbled from their mouths. Jawbones deteriorated and crumbled beneath the fragile flesh, leaving the patient permanently disfigured, unable to speak, and entirely incapable of consuming solid food. Yet, the physical mutilation was merely a grim prelude to the profound, inescapable psychological destruction inflicted upon the fragile human mind. As the mercury systematically dissolved the protective barriers of the brain, a creeping, irreversible insanity began to take root in the shadows. Tremors racked the body, a relentless physical vibration that shattered any hope of rest, driving the patient deeper into a state of profound exhaustion. Debilitating paranoia, terrifying hallucinations, and severe depression transformed their final waking hours into a waking, inescapable psychological hellscape. The tragic irony was an absolute masterpiece of historical cruelty. The prescribed medicine was infinitely more devastating than the underlying affliction itself. They were systematically poisoned by the very authorities they trusted, locked in dark, lonely rooms to slowly dissolve under the banner of healing. Arsenic, another favorite of the Victorian medicine cabinet, was similarly consumed in alarming quantities to cure everything from morning sickness to chronic fatigue. Women seeking a pale, aristocratic complexion willingly ingested arsenic wafers, slowly eroding their internal organs for the sake of a ghostly, fashionable aesthetic. The relentless, agonizing stomach pains and the eventual bloody vomiting were dismissed as a necessary purge of the body's impure, stagnant humors. The laboratories of the era were not places of meticulous, sterile science, but chaotic kitchens brewing elixirs of absolute, concentrated misery. The physicians who prescribed these lethal tonics watched impassively from the shadows, convinced that the catastrophic physical collapse was a necessary step toward equilibrium. They recorded the catastrophic failure of the human organs meticulously in their leather-bound journals, mistaking the symptoms of profound poisoning for the disease's exit. We are left staring at the heavy frosted glass vials, recognizing them not as vessels of hope, but as miniature, highly concentrated execution chambers. The silent, suffocating death delivered by these chemicals was devoid of the theatrical spectacle of the bone saw, yet infinitely more cruel in its duration. It was a cold, calculated descent into physical and mental oblivion, wrapped in the deceptive, comforting language of professional medical intervention. The faceless silhouette trapped in the mercury box remains a haunting testament to an era perfectly willing to sacrifice the mind to save the flesh. Their localized, quiet suffering echoes through the annals of history, a grim reminder of a time when the medicine cabinet was a loaded weapon. But even as the heavy metals slowly devoured the sanity of millions, a new, far darker chapter of scientific betrayal was quietly being written in the morgues. The true horror was not merely what these ambitious men were willing to prescribe, but the unspeakable actions they took when the patients finally stopped breathing. As the suffocating fumes of the apothecary clear, we are left standing in the chilling, absolute silence of the morgue. It is here, among the cold marble slabs and the heavy scent of formaldehyde, that history reveals its most disturbing paradox. We must confront the very men who orchestrated this era of unmitigated agony and ask ourselves a profoundly uncomfortable question. Were the architects of these rusted tools and toxic elixirs truly brilliant pioneers, or merely state-sanctioned psychopaths indulging their darkest curiosities? Look closely at the faceless silhouette of the Victorian anatomist, hunched over a stolen corpse in the flickering, high-contrast gloom. His hands, stained with the oxidized blood of 100 agonizing failures, are the very same hands that ultimately mapped our salvation. This is the horrifying twist at the dark core of medical history that modern society desperately tries to sanitize and forget. Every sterile, life-saving procedure we take for granted today was originally funded by a terrifying currency of unspeakable human suffering. How many screaming patients had to bleed to death on wooden tables before surgeons finally understood the intricate puzzle of the vascular system? How many conscious minds were shattered by the trephine before we accidentally stumbled upon the delicate boundaries of the brain's lobes? The chilling truth is that the profound ignorance of the era was only shattered by a relentless, entirely unethical persistence. These physicians operated in an absolute void of knowledge, forced to learn the delicate mechanics of life by methodically analyzing the brutal mechanics of death. When living patients succumbed to the trauma of the bone saw or the poison of the mercury box, their grim utility did not end. They were quietly transported to damp subterranean dissection rooms, where their brutalized forms became the silent textbooks of a desperate medical generation. But as the demand for anatomical knowledge wildly outpaced the natural supply of the deceased, a new, infinitely darker industry was born. Enter the era of the resurrection men, shadowy figures who prowled the fog-choked graveyards to violently uproot the recently buried. The medical establishment, driven by an insatiable, obsessive need to understand the human machine, became the primary financial patrons of organized grave robbery. Can we truly call them noble healers when they actively funded the desecration of the dead under the quiet cover of a moonless night? The line between a dedicated scientist and a monstrous ghoul blurred entirely within the pitch-black shadows of the medical college courtyards. We see a faceless silhouette handing a heavy purse of blood money to a mud-soaked grave robber in exchange for a stained burlap sack. Inside that sack lies a stolen father, a violently unearthed mother, sacrificed without consent to the insatiable hunger of anatomical progress. Yet, without this grotesque, entirely illegal harvest of human remains, the intricate, beautiful map of our internal organs would have remained a permanent mystery. The brilliant anatomical atlases of the 19th century, with their breathtakingly precise illustrations, were drawn entirely from the flesh of murdered or stolen paupers. It is a profound moral contradiction that forces us to critically question the very ethical foundation upon which modern civilization is constructed. Did the ultimate triumph of modern surgery retroactively justify the horrific, agonizing trial and error inflicted upon thousands of conscious victims? Imagine the crushing psychological dissonance experienced by these early physicians, men who were acutely aware of the unspeakable torment they inflicted daily. Surviving diaries of the era reveal surgeons who suffered from severe insomnia, their waking hours haunted by the phantom screams of the unanesthetized. They drank heavily before entering the operating theater, desperately trying to numb their own humanity before destroying the humanity of another. They were not simply sadists reveling in the splatter of blood. They were deeply traumatized individuals, carrying the unbearable weight of an impossible task. They hacked through limbs and bored through skulls, because doing nothing in the face of a festering tumor or crushing infection was a guaranteed, agonizing death. They were navigating a labyrinth of absolute darkness, forced to use the crude, blunt instruments of torture to desperately carve a pathway toward healing. This is the inescapable, bloody paradox of our fragile human existence. Our modern biological safety was entirely purchased by their historical, physical damnation. The pristine, silver scalpels utilized in modern humming operating rooms are the direct evolutionary descendants of those rusted, agonizing butcher's blades. Every single time an anesthesiologist smoothly guides a patient into a painless slumber, they are silently profiting off the men who cut into waking flesh. We elevate these early medical pioneers to the status of scientific saints, erecting marble statues in their honor while deliberately ignoring the blood pooling at their feet. But the shadows of the past are incredibly long, and the ghosts of the surgical theater refuse to be entirely scrubbed from the historical record. They linger in the cold, clinical spaces between our modern technological miracles, whispering a terrifying truth that we desperately attempt to ignore. The pursuit of extreme knowledge always demands a sacrificial offering, and in the savage realm of early medicine, that offering was conscious human agony. So we are left to ponder, staring into the deep, high-contrast void of our collective history, frantically weighing the screaming past against the silent present. Does the spectacular, undeniable miracle of our current medical sanctuary wash away the profound sins committed within the laboratory of shadows? Or are we merely the lucky beneficiaries of a prolonged, centuries-long crime against humanity, peacefully enjoying the spoils of an unforgivable, bloody war? The faceless anatomist slowly wipes his silver blade on a soiled cloth, his posture heavy with the burden of playing a flawed, violent god. He turns away from the mutilated form on the marble slab, leaving us completely alone with the chilling, echoing implications of his desperate work. We have reached the ultimate turning point of our descent, the agonizing realization that salvation and slaughter are merely two sides of the exact same rusted coin. Beneath the grand, terrifying narrative of scientific progress lies a vast, silent ocean of unrecorded human despair. We must now turn our gaze away from the ambitious surgeons and look into the suffocating shadows where the true cost was paid. Strip away the historical romance, the dusty medical journals, and the marble statues erected in the name of enlightened healing. What remains is the chilling, profound isolation of a nameless patient, trembling uncontrollably on a cold, unyielding wooden table. They are entirely stripped of their identity, reduced to a fragile, faceless silhouette swallowed by the high-contrast monochrome of the operating theater. Imagine the overwhelming, crushing weight of their solitude in those agonizing moments before the rusted blade breached their skin. There were no comforting words whispered into their ears, no sterile monitors softly beeping to validate their fading, fragile existence. They were surrounded only by the apathetic gaze of medical students and the suffocating scent of cheap cigars and stale sweat. The rough hemp ropes binding their wrists and ankles offered the only physical grounding in a room spinning with sheer terror. The cold bite of the ambient air against their exposed skin served as a cruel reminder of their profound, terrifying vulnerability. Even the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seemed to lean in, acting as monstrous voyeurs, witnessing the systematic dismantling of a human life. To be a patient in this era was to endure the ultimate violation, surrendering absolute control to men wielding rusted instruments of torture. These were mothers who would never again hold their children, their final moments defined entirely by the tearing of flesh and unimaginable agony. These were fathers who walked willingly into the slaughterhouse, choosing the microscopic hope of survival over the slow, inevitable decay of gangrene. Their muffled cries were not recorded as heartbreaking tragedies, but clinically documented as mere biological reflexes in the grim ledger of early medicine. They clung to fragmented memories in the darkness, the faint smile of a loved one serving as a fragile, desperate shield against the pain. But the relentless friction of the saw and the heavy mechanical breathing of the surgeon quickly drowned out any comforting thoughts. You can almost hear the ragged, desperate intake of breath, a hollow, echoing sound trapped against the damp stone walls of the chamber. It is the sound of a human spirit being violently pushed past the absolute physical and psychological limits of natural endurance. In the pitch-black corners of these forgotten rooms, the boundary between the living and the dead was terrifyingly thin and incredibly bloody. When the shock finally overwhelmed their exhausted nervous system, the transition from life to death was rarely a peaceful drift into sleep. It was a violent, chaotic departure, marked by the metallic stench of their own blood pooling on the splintered floorboards beneath them. And as their heart struggled to beat its final erratic rhythm, the world around them did not pause to mourn the catastrophic loss. The surgeon simply wiped his crimson blade on a soiled apron, calling impatiently for the next trembling silhouette to take their place in the dark. Think of the profound indignity they suffered even after their final breath was extinguished in the suffocating gloom of the theater. Their broken bodies were often denied the peace of a quiet grave, tossed instead into the subterranean dissection rooms to be further violated. They became anonymous anatomical puzzles, their flesh coldly carved away to satisfy the insatiable curiosity of a medical establishment that failed them. History is always written by the victors, by the men who ultimately discovered the cures and claimed the glory of the scientific revolution. But this ultimate victory was entirely built upon the fractured bones and silenced voices of thousands of forgotten ordinary individuals. They did not volunteer to be martyrs for medical science. They were forced into that gruesome role by sheer desperation and relentless disease. We owe them a debt of gratitude that can never truly be repaid, a profound acknowledgement of their involuntary, agonizing sacrifice. Their pain was the brutal, necessary currency that purchased the miraculous, sterile sanctuaries where we now safely seek our own healing. Every successful modern surgery is a quiet echo of their suffering, a testament to the unimaginable price paid for our current biological safety. So let us linger for a moment in this chilling darkness, standing in solemn solidarity beside the faceless silhouette on the wooden table. Let us bear witness to their solitary terror, honoring the silent, agonizing final moments that history has so callously attempted to erase. We cannot change the past, nor can we undo the horrific physical trauma inflicted within these claustrophobic, unsanitary chambers of despair. But we can absolutely refuse to let their agony be reduced to a mere footnote in the triumphant, sanitized narrative of human progress. The human cost of the age of ignorance was an ocean of tears, a symphony of screams forever trapped in the sepia tones of history. As the flickering candlelight slowly extinguishes, plunging the operating theater into pure, undisturbed blackness, their memory remains eternally etched in the shadows. We sleep safely through our surgeries today only because they were forced to endure the waking nightmare of the rusted, unyielding blade. We return from the suffocating pitch-black darkness of the Victorian medical theater, stepping finally into the blinding, sterile, and painless light of the modern age. Today, we surrender our fragile bodies to the surgical blade with a quiet, unquestioning confidence, drifting into a chemically induced void free of any terror. We wake up entirely repaired, our agonizing physiological failures completely corrected, while we slept peacefully through the absolute, quiet miracle of modern surgical science. But as the humming modern monitors beep in reassuring, rhythmic harmony, we must remember the profound, blood-soaked foundation upon which this clinical sanctuary is firmly built. In the opening moments of our terrifying descent, we asked a fundamental question regarding the fragile boundary between desperate medical salvation and pure, unmitigated torture. The chilling answer, heavily obscured beneath centuries of celebrated scientific triumph, is that for a terrifyingly long epoch, that invisible boundary simply did not exist. The desperate act of healing was inherently indistinguishable from an act of extreme physical violence, executed with rusted tools and devastating, slow-acting, suffocating poisons. We must soberly recognize that the sterile silver scalpel of the modern surgeon was forged directly in the screaming, bloody crucible of the age of ignorance. Every painless, precise incision made today carries the silent, heavy echo of a nameless patient who was strapped violently to a splintered, unyielding wooden table. We are currently standing comfortably upon the shattered bones and deeply traumatized minds of thousands of faceless silhouettes who had absolutely no choice but to endure. Their agonizing, involuntary sacrifices, their frantic, desperate thrashing against the abrasive hemp ropes, directly purchased the sophisticated anatomical maps that guarantee our current biological safety. Humanity did not conquer the terrifying failures of the human body through divine intervention, but by ruthlessly marching through a dark, terrifying valley of collective suffering. The ambitious physicians of the past, with their blood-stiffened frock coats and desperately flawed theories, were the ruthless architects of a future they could never comprehend. They willingly inflicted a waking hell on Earth so that subsequent luckier generations might eventually find a way to quietly, mercifully, put the conscious mind to sleep. As we look toward an increasingly advanced technological future, where microscopic robotics and genetic engineering promise to eradicate disease entirely, we must remain profoundly grounded. We must absolutely never allow the highly sanitized, triumphant narrative of modern human progress to completely erase the devastating human cost that paid for our comfort. The next time you are asked to close your eyes under the blinding clinical surgical lights, take a fleeting moment to acknowledge the deep, suffocating shadows of the past. Remember the deafening crunch of the rusted bone saw, the erratic flickering tallow candle, and the undeniable truth that our painless present was entirely subsidized by their nightmare. The human body remains a remarkably fragile, terrifying mystery. And while we have successfully silenced the agonizing screams of the operating room, the historical darkness is only sleeping. Because as long as our mortal flesh can fail and our bones can break, the anonymous ghosts of the medical theater will forever stand silently waiting in the periphery. As the heavy iron doors of medical history slowly swing shut, we are left entirely alone in the suffocating silence. The echoes of those rusted saws and the phantom screams of the unanesthetized will forever haunt the sterile corridors of our modern hospitals. We have successfully traded the brutal physical butchery of the past for the quiet, chemical oblivion of the present. Yet, beneath our fragile skin and modern arrogance, the human body remains a terrifyingly vulnerable vessel just waiting to fail. We are nothing more than intricate biological machines, perpetually suspended on a razor-thin wire between miraculous survival and absolute decay. The dark laboratory of shadows may have closed its doors, but the relentless, unyielding specter of human mortality never truly sleeps. It merely waits patiently in the periphery, forcing us to wonder what modern medical miracles future generations will eventually view as barbaric. Perhaps in a few centuries, they will look back at our silver scalpels and harsh radiation treatments with the exact same creeping horror. They will marvel at our primitive desperation, pitying the faceless silhouettes of our era who willingly submitted to the knife. True progress is written exclusively in the blood of the unfortunate, a relentless cycle of agonizing trial and monumental silent error. If you found yourself captivated by this descent into the macabre, allow yourself to linger a little longer in the dark with us. There are countless other shadowy chapters of forgotten history waiting to be unearthed from the cold, unforgiving dirt of the past. Consider leaving a trace of your presence below, and ensure you are subscribed for our next journey into the abyss. Until we meet again in the flickering candlelight, hold fast to your profound gratitude the next time you drift into a painless sleep, because the silent ghosts of the operating theater are always watching, reminding us that every breath is merely a temporary reprieve.